For centuries, seekers of liberation have faced a paralyzing choice: retreat from society to purify the mind, or stay and perform your duties. The 18th and final chapter of the Bhagavad Gita confronts this exact friction. It provides a systematic psychological framework designed to resolve the tension between human obligation and spiritual freedom. The dialogue opens with the warrior Arjuna paralyzed by this dilemma. Facing a catastrophic war, he questions how one can execute heavy social and martial duties without accumulating the karmic baggage that binds a person to material suffering. To find an answer, the text examines two competing models of renunciation. The first is sannyasa. Historically, scholars define this as the physical abandonment of all desire-driven actions, a literal retreat from social life and worldly ambition. The competing model is Tyaga. Here, the practitioner remains fully embedded in the chaotic reality of the world. Instead of abandoning the work itself, Tyaga requires the internal relinquishment of the fruits or results of all performed actions. Resolving this distinction between physical renunciation and internal detachment sets the stage for the rest of the text, providing the prerequisite for the liberation Arjuna seeks. Krishna delivers a precise ruling on this paradox. He rejects physical passivity. Attempting to abandon societal work due to burnout or physical difficulty is viewed as a manifestation of ego, not spiritual advancement. Tyaga, internal detachment while acting, is given ultimate primacy. The text issues a specific mandate. 3 categories of action must never be abandoned: sacrifice, charity, and austerity. These are not arbitrary rituals. They serve as mechanical instruments for the mind. Engaging in sacrifice and charity actively refines the human intellect and steadily wipes away deep-seated egoic impressions. True renunciation requires full engagement in necessary action while severing the ego's possessive attachment to the outcomes. It is an internal reorientation that neutralizes selfish desire, bypassing the need for physical retreat. To execute detachment, Sankhya philosophy deconstructs action. Suffering stems from the ego believing it is the sole doer. The text enumerates 5 interdependent factors: the physical field, the empirical doer, the sensory instruments, the energetic endeavor, and daiva, the overarching divine factor. Individual effort and agency represent only 2 variables within a 5-part dynamic system. Viewing the isolated self as the sole actor reveals an unrefined intellect, trapping the individual in a cycle of existential anxiety. Once an individual comprehends this distributed system, the ego loses its false sense of absolute ownership over the process. Action occurs, but it ceases to leave binding karmic residue upon the soul. With the mechanics of action established, the text pivots to a comprehensive psychological analysis of human behavior. It categorizes human intelligence, resolve, and action according to the 3 gunas: sattva, rajas, and tamas. These are the underlying qualities of material nature, functioning essentially as the operating systems running the human hardware. A mind running on sattvic intelligence perceives a unified reality present across all diverse beings. It performs obligatory duty as a matter of cosmic alignment, completely free from personal attachment. Rajasic intelligence perceives reality as fragmented. It views distinct entities as isolated and separate. Actions initiated under this Rajasic move are driven by immense strain, deep egoism, and the constant pursuit of sensory gratification. Tamasic intelligence is shrouded in cognitive darkness. It stubbornly clings to narrow concepts, systematically reverses truth, and acts out of pure delusion and moral indifference. 2 people can perform the exact same physical task, but with entirely different spiritual consequences. Advancement is determined not by the external appearance of the work, but entirely by which of these 3 psychological operating systems is driving the intellect. The Gita measures happiness by plotting pleasure against time. Rajasic happiness spikes initially from sensory contact, but inevitably plummets into disappointment, turning into poison. Conversely, sattvic happiness requires initial discipline, tasting like poison at first, but yields a permanent state of nectar. This temporal dynamic governs human choice. Rajasic pursuits trap individuals because the reward is immediate, while the pain is delayed. Sattvic pursuits elevate consciousness precisely because the initial friction builds the capacity for permanent psychological clarity. The chapter then scales this internal psychological framework outward into the realm of social ethics, introducing the fourfold social order. The text does not frame this as a rigid hereditary system. It presents a functional classification based on an individual's dominant gunas and innate psychophysical temperaments. This leads to the spiritual imperative of swadharma. The Gita declares that it is far better to perform one's own natural duty, even if executed with minor imperfections, to attempt another person's duty simply because it carries higher prestige. Every practical endeavor contains some degree of inherent limitation, much like fire is accompanied by smoke. But when secular work aligns with a person's innate disposition, it lacks psychological friction. The labor itself transforms into a direct act of spiritual adoration. This alignment maps the ultimate progression of the human soul. Mind purification matures into transcendent wisdom, which subsequently blossoms into absolute devotion. This progression reaches its peak in verse 18.66, known as the Charama Shloka. Here, the seeker receives a final secret instruction to relinquish all reliance on personal righteousness, external rituals, and self-directed moral constructs. But this climactic verse contains a significant academic and theological tension surrounding a specific Sanskrit root word, vraj. In many interpretations, vraj is translated as come. This translation implies the seeker must surrender directly to the localized physical personality of the speaker. However, the linguistic translation of vraj is to go. This distinction aligns with a previous instruction in verse 62, where the speaker directs Arjuna to go and seek shelter in an unmanifest supreme divine. With this interpretation, the focus shifts from a requirement for personal worship to an ultimate surrender of spiritual vanity, the final letting go of all egoic constructs to rest in universal divine grace. Upon receiving this knowledge, Arjuna's psychological restoration is complete. His confusion is destroyed, his memory of his true identity is restored, and he stands ready to execute righteous action without attachment. The text closes with an ecstatic declaration from the narrator, Sanjaya, establishing a final universal principle for human accomplishment. Wherever transcendent divine wisdom is perfectly integrated with dedicated, disciplined human endeavor, there will exist spiritual radiance, victory, prosperity, and moral justice. True success in reality demands both.